What's up, everybody? This is Can't Stop the Unk, and I'm here with lesson 5. So today we're going to be going over static methods. So there's two types of methods, I guess. There's static and then non-static methods. And we'll explain what those are in the next lesson. But for now, I just want to go over the fundamentals and how to actually just create a method, right? In this case, a static method. So for this, we're only going to use static methods, right? But the thing is, if you know how to set up a static method, you pretty much know how to do a non-static method. So if you know one thing, you know the other, right? The only difference you have to know is just a higher level concept, which is something we're going to go over, like I said, in the next lesson. So why do you use a method? Well, it's pretty useful to use in like when you write code that does something and you want other things to use that same code, you can just, instead of retyping everything, you can just call that method again. And when you do object-oriented programming, it's really useful to access those methods. So remember the dot operator that we used before, like for the string methods? That's because those are actually methods that people wrote code on that does stuff, right? So when you use those objects, you can call those methods and do stuff with it. So it's really useful. You might be wondering, how do you write a static method, right? So first you need to write public static when you write your first method, right? And for now, you just have to memorize this as something you just do with no explanation, but later on you'll know why you write public static. So if you want a static method, you have to write public static. And then right here, when you write int or void or string, right, it has to be a return type of something. So what that means is after you write public static, the next thing you have to write is what kind of type are you dealing with and what do you want to return from that method, right? So since we're adding two numbers, right, we're adding two integers, obviously we want to return the sum of those two integers, right? So what type are we returning? We're returning an integer, right? So that's what this is. You're returning an int. And then you put your method name, just like your variable name. You have to have a name for your method. And then your parameters, right? So in this case, our parameters are two integers called num1 and num2. So what we do here is we take those two integers, num1, num2, right? We take those two parameters, we add them, store into a variable called sum, and then we return that summation, right? So what happens is when I have my integer variable num, right? I just create an integer variable and I want to add those two numbers, right? I just want to add two numbers. I can just call the method name, right? I named it my method add two numbers, right? So I can just call it like this and then parentheses, right? So inside of parentheses, we need our parameters. We need two integers, right? So we pass in two integers and it makes sense. So I pass in 5 and I pass in 10, right? So this num should equal 15 because that's what it returns, because it just adds those two numbers. So when I print it and run it, we should expect to see 15, which is what it prints, right? And then the other two examples I have here are multiplying and dividing two numbers, right? So this should be 50 and then this should be 0. So, I'll show you the division method and the multiply method real quick. So obviously I just multiply two numbers and then return it, right? For my division, I divide num1 by num2, right? So when it's 5 divided by 10, when I pass it in here, you would expect 0.5, right? In real world elementary mathematics. But here returns 0. And my question is to you, so you should pause this video and think about why it returns 0. Okay, the answer is coming. It's because you're dividing integers, right? From lesson 1, when you divide two integers, it rounds down. So 5 divided by 10 is 0.5, but it rounds down because we have to use whole numbers like integers, so it's 0. Okay, so now we're going to move on to different types of methods. So instead of returning an integer, we're going to work with voids and returning a string type. So what you should be careful when you work with void methods is something like this. So I have a string, right? And it's called hi, right? If I print it out, it prints out hi. And then I call change string, which means when I pass in this hi string, I want to change it to something else. So when I call it, you can see here, I take the string str, which is hi currently, and now I want to change it to bam, right? So when I change it to bam, I print it out, right? So inside the change string method, so we're inside this method, right? Which is why I wrote this. It prints out bam, right? So that makes sense because we changed the string. But when we go out of the method, right? So we're here, so we just called this and it printed out inside the change string method, bam, right? Now we're out of the method and we move on to the next line of code, right? And you can notice that the method didn't actually change the string. When I print out string again, str, it goes back to hi, right? So what I hope you're noticing is that this is maybe slightly confusing because when we pass in change str, we pass in the variable and we pass it in and change it, and we know it changed, right? Because we printed it out here. But once the method ends, the string changes back to its original string, which is said hi, right? It's no longer bam, even though you might expect it to be bam. Okay, so what's happening here? So I'm gonna try to use this diagram to explain what's going on behind the scenes. So in your main method, right? So just ignore all the push, pop, peek, top, bottom, like just focus on this part right here where you see the actual drawers or boxes, right? So in your main method, you have this stack, like this stack called number1, right? So that's what you're currently on. When you start your program, you're in the main method, right? You're in the main program and you have number1 right here. When you call change string, right, what Java does, it adds another stack, right? So stack 2. And then your code, when it executes, it's executed basically in this stack, right? And then what happens is when you get out of that stack, this number 2 is just gone. Like it just gets removed, right? And then we just have number1 back. And we're back on stack number1. So whatever you did in number 2, unless it's communicating with like stack number1, nothing's gonna happen. So this is why when we change the string from hi to bam, it goes back to hi again. It's because in stack 2, we changed it to bam. So when we print it, it's bam. But then when we go out of the method, this stack number 2 is gone and we're back to stack number 1, and therefore it's back to hi. So this is a very simplified explanation, but it's good enough, I believe, to explain what's going on, to give you a good understanding of why the string value goes from, it seemed to change to bam and it just goes back to hi, right? You didn't actually change. So this is actually a common bug that a lot of beginner programmers have and struggle with. So I think this is really important to point out. So in our next example, we're gonna go over two things. We're gonna go over one, how to actually change a string value, right? Instead of having it revert back to its original hi string, we're gonna actually change it. And we're gonna also go over method overloading. So let's first go over what method overloading is. So you can notice I have I call change string again, right? I call the method change string, but this one doesn't have a parameter like it does here, right? So what I did down here was I actually created two methods with the exact same name right here. So you can see that these two methods are called change string, right? And they have the exact same name, but one has a parameter string str and the other doesn't, right? So you might be thinking, how is this legal, right? How can you have two of the same name? Because when you do variables, you can't have two variables with the same name. Well, you can have two different you can have the same method name as long as they have different parameters, right? So because when you call the method name, even though they have the same name, Java knows which one you're calling, because if you put a parameter, if you call change string and put a parameter inside it, like I did with the first example, Java knows you're calling this one, right? Because it has a parameter. But if I don't pass any parameters, then Java knows that it's calling change string. So this is what we call method overloading, because I guess we're overloading the same method name, right? But Java knows which one to call based on your parameters. So that's what method overloading is. So what this method does, the one without parameters, all it does is return bam, right? It returns a string, says bam. So when I go up here, when I call change string without any parameters, I set the variable str equal to whatever change string returns, right? So remember, str equals high right now. But when I set it equal to change string, which returns the string bam, str is now really going to be bam in the first stack, in the main stack, right? Stack number 1. This str is going to be changed to bam. So when I print it out, you can see that it prints out bam. So that's actually how you change the actual string value, right? So make sure you think of things when you call method, just remember you're calling a stack, you're adding a stack on top of it. So you gotta make sure that you know how to communicate with the stack, like the first stack below it, right? Because you wanna make sure that you're interacting with things correctly so you get the changes you want. So the way you do this in this case is set string str equal to change string, right? That will actually physically change the string to bam. Now before we end this lesson, I just want to go over some quick notes about methods. So always remember that methods have brackets and you need to close them, right? So whenever you begin your method, open it with a bracket and end your method with a bracket. And then the other thing I want to go over is your main method, right? I've been calling this main thing a method, right? So what I want you to notice is it is a method. It's a static method that you have public static, and its return type is void, right? So which means it doesn't have a return type, and we have a name for it. We call it main, right? And then it even has parameters, right? It takes in an array of strings, right? Which is a valid parameter. You can actually pass in arrays of integers, arrays of string, right? So or an array of booleans if you want. But what the main method contains is basically you write public static and you write void and you write main, and then you put string bracket args, right? And you can see that it even has brackets around it, right? Just like a method, right? It is a static method. So why is it called main? So it's just by convention, so that when you want to run the program, if I call this something else, like I don't know, bam, or let's call it ping, right? So it's valid code, right? But when I try to run it, you won't be able to run it as a Java program. It's because basically the thing that when you execute the program, like it's looking for the main method so that it can run the program, right? So it's just by convention that if you want to run your program, right, and you want to see some results through the console, you just have to have a main method to run your results, and you have to call it main. But otherwise, it's basically the same as any other static method. So that's what I want you to notice. So of course, the next video I'm going to upload will have the project in relation to lesson 5. And in the next lesson, we're going to go over non-static methods versus static methods, the difference between them. We're going to go higher level concepts, and we're going to go over classes and objects. And yeah, I'll see you then.